So we'd like to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon. It's a real timely topic for sure, rising to the challenge, developing supportive housing in trying times with historic commitments from both the city and state of New York. We've got a terrific panel today that we've put together. I'd like to very, very briefly just introduce the folks on the panel. Starting off with Paul Freitag. Paul is the Executive Director for the West Side Federation for Senior and Supportive Housing, which is one of the largest developers of supportive housing in the New York metro market. Been doing so for over 40 years, and they provide housing and services to tenancy of all different types. Kevin Hoffman, who's on the end, President of Richmond Housing Resources, which is one of the largest syndicators of tax credits in the supportive housing world. Richmond has had a long history of being involved in supportive housing and has been a good partner to a lot of folks at this conference for a lot of years. So thank you, Kevin, for being on the panel. Next up, Leora Jontiff, Vice President of Multifamily Programs for New York State Homes and Community Renewal. Leora is focused on the construction and preservation of transactions involving both 4% and 9% around the state of New York. As most folks know, Governor Cuomo set a goal of 6,000 units of supportive housing over 5 years, and based on the volume at the state, we appear well on our way to getting there. So we look forward to hearing from Leora more about that today. And then Molly Park, last but not least, for sure. The Deputy Commissioner of Development for the New York City Housing Preservation and Development. In her capacity as Deputy Commissioner, Molly oversees pretty much everything development at the agency, including storm recovery. So if that's a flood, we all look to Molly. So, and I didn't plan that. So.
Nice.
Okay, I apologize for that. I have no idea why that just happened. But our primary responsibility is to ensure the agency is meeting the production goals as outlined under the Mayor's Housing Plan. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Again, I think the panel is really quite timely. The industry has certainly gone through a number of changes over the past 18 months with pre-tax reform, tax reform itself, post-tax reform. There's been a lot of changes in the market. Certainly that, coupled with rising land values and rising construction costs, are making deals a lot more difficult today to put together. The resultant pressures of that is folks like Kevin and developers like Paul, and certainly the state and city folks, are becoming more of financial engineers, perhaps more so today than ever, in trying to put deals together. My apologies again. I'm just checking to make sure they're not taking the wall down. So we're going to talk a little bit about everything today and how it's impacted the industry and how everyone is sort of adapting to the new world that we live in today. So before we really get started, I thought it would be great if perhaps Paul could talk a little bit about today and kind of run through a couple of slides about what it is to be a developer in today's market, and then we can dive into some of the topics that we're going to discuss. So thank you. Paul?
You're the clerk. There you go.
Okay, so before we either ascend or descend, depending on your viewpoint, into talking about all the different programs and the different opportunities that you have for funding affordable housing, supportive housing, I thought what I will do is I'm going to just take 5 minutes to show you 3 projects that WSFISH is currently working on. 2 of them are in construction, one's just about to finish, and then the third will be closing hopefully very shortly. And I think these 3 projects, they all use a mix of city and state financing. They're all trying to figure out these new programs. They also are somewhat representative of, I think, current trends in developing supportive housing in New York City. So just a quick run through, and then we'll get into a conversation about all the different programs and the different complexities and opportunities that are present now in developing supportive housing. So this is in chronological order. So Tres Puentes is a project that WSFISH has started construction on 2 years ago. It'll be finishing up this summer. Hopefully we'll get our TCO this summer. It is located in the South Bronx. It's shown by the orange dots on the western edge of East 138th Street I'll be also talking about another project, Millbrook, which is at the other end, on the eastern end of 138th Street. So Tres Puentes is sort of representative of a lot of discussion of opportunities that owners of current affordable housing have to use underutilized parcels on their site to develop new affordable housing. So Wisfish was the owner of Brinken Court, which is a 202 located in the middle. And we are currently building 2 new buildings on either side of Brinken Court. So we have Tres Puentes West and Tres Puentes East. So Tres Puentes West is the bigger building. It has 119 units. These are all 100% senior buildings. Tres Puentes West actually will have a pharmacy and health clinic located on the first floor. We are partnering with Urban Health, Inc., who is putting an FQHC into the building. And then we're creating a brand new social services hub that will actually serve all 3 buildings. The buildings are actually connected internally. Oops, sorry, let's go back one. Tres Puentes East is 56 units. It's sort of a simpler building. However, one of the interesting things about this building is we have an existing space for a senior center in Brinken Court, and we're actually extending that into the new Tres Puentes East. We'll be operating the senior center in partnership with another Bronx organization. And then here I'll have a slide like this for each of the projects. So this shows all the different sources for Tres Puentes. So Tres Puentes we think of as being primarily a state project. As you can see, the state wins in terms of the number of funding sources that came into the program. But the city is also providing important sources of funding that are making this project possible. And in particular, the social services subsidy is coming from the ESHI program, which actually didn't exist as we were first beginning to do this program, this building. And so ESHI was actually sort of merged into this program as it was going into close and begin development. This building also has project-based Section 8 vouchers from NYCHA, which is really what is makes it work when you're doing senior supportive housing. Okay, so the second project is a project we closed on 1 year ago. It's been in construction for about a year. It's Millbrook Terrace. And this is representative of sort of another group of projects where the project is being developed on underutilized NYCHA land. So Wisfish was one of the recipients of the Next Gen NYCHA RFP competition that happened a couple of years ago. And we won the opportunity to develop new senior housing, also with the senior center at the Millbrook houses in the South Bronx. This project has a total of 158 units, 51 studios, 107 one-bedrooms, and it too is getting NYCHA project-based Section 8 vouchers, which really makes the project work. So this project, in this case, we think of this as being a city profile project. The majority of the funding sources are coming from the city, but New York State is also providing important funding through HHAP and also through their through NYSERDA, which is supporting some of the energy efficiency moves within the building. And then once again, the social services is being funded in this building through ESHI. The final project is one that we hope to be closing soon. It's located on West 108th Street between Amsterdam and Columbus. And this too is once again an example of sort of a existing social services provider, affordable housing not-for-profit, taking advantage of land that they have. In this case, Wisfish owns a shelter that we've operated for 30 years, which is a shelter that provides shelter services to homeless seniors. And it's a fantastic program that we run, but the building itself is falling apart. And so we are actually knocking down Valley Lodge, our shelter, and the city is putting into this 2 parking garages that flank Valley Lodge. And so the combination of the 2 parking garages plus Valley Lodge creates a site on the west side of 108th Street, which runs almost half the block. It's be quite a large building. And at one end, we actually have a new Valley Lodge, which is expanding from 92 to 110 beds. And then, in addition to that, we'll have a total of 198 units of new, affordable, and supportive housing. In this particular case, there is 119 units of senior supportive housing, and the balance of it is straight-ahead, low-income, affordable housing for families. And this, once again, this is an even more complex project in terms of financing. It's primarily a city profile with all the city sources, From the state, we'd have HHAP again and NYSERDA. And then because this is actually also a shelter, we have funding coming in order to fund the shelter as well. And then in this case, our social services and rental subsidy sources come from both the city and the state. We have ESHI, and we have the New York 1515 coming into the project. So 3 projects, all quite large projects, all sort of taking advantages of both the opportunities from both the city and the state, both complex, but both obviously, projects that are going to be really addressing the need for supportive housing within New York City. Thank you.
No, terrific. Thank you, Paul. I think I counted no less than 7 or 8 different sources of subsidy or sources in each one of those transactions. Clearly, the state's initiative behind ESHI and certainly the cities between 1515 are both playing really integral roles in helping to get projects done today. I thought it'd be great to hear from both Molly and Leora just about a little bit about those programs and some of the it's a couple years old now, kind of working its way through the system. Just would love to hear what's been happening and how you see it going forward.
Sure. So I think probably a lot of people were here for the 1515 panel in the previous session, so I will be relatively brief. But I wanted to start by pausing on the concept of 1515. This is a city-funded, project-based rental subsidy. It's something that we've never done before, and as far as I know, nobody else has ever done before. It is hugely important. I think particularly in a time when federal resources are quite uncertain. We've historically used the project-based Section 8 and the continuum of care funds to be able to do the rent subsidy that goes into supportive housing. We continue to leverage those as much as we possibly can, but I think counting on the federal government to solve our problems is not a great place to be right now. So I think I'm incredibly proud that the city is doing this city-funded rental subsidy program. It all started well before I got back to HPD, so I'm not taking credit for it myself, but I'm incredibly proud of my colleagues' work. So it is rental subsidy tied to FMR. It is service money that is coming through HRA, and then HPD's, combined with HPD's capital program, the supportive housing loan program, can also be used in other programs. We are seeing increasingly supportive housing components in ELA projects, in senior projects, so there are a lot of different ways to mix and match different financing sources. I think, clearly one of the take-home messages from what Paul was walking us through is that these are incredibly complex projects that really do rely on a wide variety of funding sources. So while the city and the state right now each have their own independent combination of funding sources, both on the operating and on the capital side, it is not at all unusual to have them work together. I think, Leora and I have been talking quite a lot about how we can have them work even better together, but I think the bottom line is they are playing relatively well in the sandbox now, and we are happy to continue to work with people to make sure that we are using all the resources that are available to make sure that we are maximizing supportive housing production. I'm happy to talk more about 1515, but since we just did an hour and a half in the previous session, I think maybe I'll pause.
I'll take Molly's lead with that. I believe my colleagues from the O agencies did a panel on the Empire State Supporting Housing Initiative, but I'll just recap it really quickly for those who couldn't make that panel. And then I'll mention a little bit about our capital, which is really where HCR plays a role in the financing of the transactions. But the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, ESHI, is a service and rental award up to $25,000 a unit, and it's to serve the entire state. So $25,000 means different things around the state, and it's up to the provider who applies. This is just for service providers to work on their budget to divide what they need for rent versus services. There are quite a number of deals in New York City that are using ESHI, but ESHI is used throughout the state, and it is the only tool around the state. And so there are many choices in New York City. There are fewer choices for my colleagues serving vulnerable populations throughout the state of New York. The populations are wide and broad, and the list is in the RFP, which I believe is due soon, I think June 19th. And usually the process works like you get a conditional award after your application's reviewed and it's scored, and it becomes committed when you actually get all your capital and your sites sorted out. The commitment typically happens, and I'll just speak to the HCR process. On the 9% side, if you receive a 9% allocation, you would be able to get your HCR award committed. And typically on the 4% side, which is the side that I work on, it's after we go to our board, we'll alert the group, and you'll get the award will get committed. I just also to clarify one thing that Dave said, I'm going to do my best to speak for the entire agency on the 9% and 4%, which I've done before, but I am working on the 4% pipeline, but I have a lot of fun nuggets on the 9% side, so I'll share. But I work with my colleague, Sean Fitzgerald, who's here, or maybe in the room, I don't know, but he's here if you have questions on the 9s. But this tool and the mechanism for award to approval is the same as I just described, and that's just about it.
So I think with ESHI too, once they receive a commitment, they have within, I think, a certain amount of time to close on a transaction.
Once they receive, after the RFP is scored, they receive a conditional award, and then they have a year to sort out their site and their capital, and that's the way it's done. So usually it's considered locked in after you either receive a 9% award or we go to our board on the HFA side.
Fantastic, thanks. So Paul and Kevin, you've both been involved in many deals over the last few years that have included either ESHI or a 1515. Just curious if there have been any issues, or maybe from the tax credit perspective, from the syndication's perspective, is any issues that the investor has raised in regards to either program?
Sure. So we closed the deal at the end of last year, Bruckner Boulevard with community access. So like Paul, it's kind of a complicated transaction. 215 units, 92 were set aside for folks with mental illness, and 20 were reserved for chronically homeless. It was considered a city deal, but again, it had state subsidy through ESHI. So the investor and the syndicator, we wanted to make sure that the OMH commitment was something that looked like what we saw in previous deals. So we worked with Moore and her team just to make sure the commitment letter, something when we're sending to an investor, they're looking at it, seeing a black line, and making sure it works out. So we started that process early on. I think the key in these transactions is to talk to your team, your folks from the state and the city, your syndicator, your lender, just to have open dialogue early and often.
And Paul?
On all three of these deals, we actually have been working with LISC, so they managed a lot of the investor relations. But the three projects, one was, the investor was Chase, with whom Whitfish has a very long, deep relationship, which I think helps move that along. The second one was interesting because we were actually going with Capital One. I think Capital One actually had some concerns. They were trying to sort of figure it out, and so they actually ended up partnering with Chase. And so it was sort of an interesting resolution in terms of how that worked. And then finally, on the one that we will be closing shortly, LISC has actually brought to the table a multi-investor fund, which is unusual. I mean, I feel like you used to have those a while ago, and they put together another one for this particular deal. And so they joined the deal sort of knowing what the deal was, and therefore it hasn't really posed a problem.
Great. So, go ahead.
I'll just chime in. We've worked very hard to make the 1515 rental subsidy look really as much like project-based Section 8 as we can. I think very much for that reason.
Right.
And I'll chime in. Molly and her staff last year brought in a lot of the syndicators, banking relationships to kind of talk about New York 1515, and their legal staff, like she was saying, mirrored it off of Section 8. So then when we provide a black line to an investor or somebody that's looking at it, it makes our job a lot easier. So that was a great step.
Right. Well, that's great. So Kevin, all of this has been happening over the last few years while tax reform is taking place.
Fun world.
Fun world is right. So if you could talk a little bit about investor appetite, not only for supportive transactions, but I think in the affordable business in general as well. I think it would be great for folks to hear what's sort of happening in the world today.
Sure. So I think as most folks know in the room, after the election, tax reform speculation, pricing dropped. This year, we're seeing pricing kind of stabilize because there's an actual market. People aren't guessing, is the tax rate 25, is it 20, is it 21, where it's going to end up, which is a good thing. I think a few things to be aware of. One would be interest rates. Not so much in CRA markets like in the city, but if interest rates rise, investors are going to want to see yields go up. So for the folks upstate that aren't in the CRA market, something to be concerned about with deals moving forward. There's also a few investors that are still trying to figure out how it affects their balance sheet. So they're kind of sitting on the sidelines for the first 6 months. And then we have a few old investors that are coming back into the market, like Fannie and Freddie, which will hopefully help kind of stabilize and fill the equity gap.
Okay, great. So it's definitely impacted the historic tax credit world as well, which is a source that a lot of folks do use as
Correct.
well. I think of all the credits, it seems like that's the one that's been impacted the most because of some of the changes that were actually made to the program.
Correct. And coming over 5 years instead of the first year, so it kind of just changes the investor return.
Right. So we've seen pricing drop about 15 cents on the federal side, if that sounds right.
Yeah.
And then on the state side, probably 5 cents, I think 5, 6 cents or something.
Yeah, that's
So,
fair.
yeah,
As you know, every deal is different, the way it's structured with pay and schedule and loss ratios, but
Right.
it's a fair assessment, yeah.
Right, so a couple of more challenges to deal with. But, so I guess, the drop in tax credit equity on every transaction usually results in a visit to either Molly or Leora
Probably both of us.
to ask, this about the subsidy program. So curious to see, hear your thoughts just about how you all are handling those conversations and some general advice for folks before they, come in to visit with you about what to ask for.
Sure. I mean, to echo what's been said, right, tax credit raises dropped 15-20%. That is a big hole in budgets in a very short period of time. I mean, we really went from, the beginning of November 2016 to the December 2016. It was very dizzying. We've kept our production up. We've in fact expanded our production. It has been a combination of fairly retail solutions. Certainly there have been places where we've had to put in additional subsidy. I think one of the reasons you're seeing so many deals with so many sources is because there's less equity coming in and you have to cobble together more sources to make a project work. I think people are getting more creative about how leveraging the various rent subsidies and being able to make that work. I think, tapping council and elected official resources to bring those dollars into projects, thinking how the community facility and commercial space plays into project budgets, all of that is going in there. I think we at HPD are going to increasingly be making sure that we are putting an adequate focus on cost containment for all of these reasons as well. So it has certainly been a challenging year plus in the tax credit market and dealing with that in our projects, but I also want to put it in context, right? We are still over $1 on virtually every project. In 2009, we were at 86 cents and we were kept production going. So I don't want to be too cheerful about it. It is a big loss of equity that came out of the federal environment, but it is not the worst it's been in, my time at HPD, and it's probably, and certainly not in the history of the tax credit program. So we should keep moving forward.
I thought I was the complaint department. Maybe not. Good. I think similar, I would echo part of the points that Molly made. Yes, we have a housing plan now at the state, and we have a lot of demand for our resources. So after the election, the markets dropped very quickly, and we had deals we had to close, and we closed them, and it's over a year later. We're still here, and we continue to have a very full pipeline on our 4% side, and demand is definitely up to do more volume cap, more supportive housing deals using volume cap, and we're happy to do that. We've improved our application, should go live tomorrow, and we are interested in still seeing deals of that type. But I think an interesting observation is that we didn't have as much demand as we thought on the 9% side, especially on the New York City supportive housing market. I think we had one supportive housing application on the 9%, and my colleagues up in Albany are open for business, and they would love to see more. And so we have the resources to close on the deals. We have the governor's housing plan, which not only is using credits and volume cap and as of right 4% credits, but we have this capital subsidy, which up until year and a half ago we didn't have. We have the shop subsidy that we can layer on deals. We layered on with HPD on the deals that we do on the city that we do together with them. But I just always like to keep in mind we work throughout the state, and New York City is extremely unique because they have multiple resources in our 5 boroughs, but outside of the city, we are it. So we have a lot of activity happening throughout the state, and we are providing credits through the 9% or the 4%, but we are potentially the only subsidy source in the deal, and we are very ready to do that on the supportive housing side. In terms of the change in the raises, I would just say that we adapted then, and we continue to adapt, and we would like our partners to continue to adapt with us as it relates to cost containment. And Molly said we see prices rising throughout the state, and we want to figure out tools to control that, and obviously land and other things that I think we'll tackle later on in the panel that are marking conditions that are causing general development costs to inflate.
Great. So, Kevin, you mentioned there's some new investors that are, or old investors coming back into the market, some other folks that are showing up. Is there any investor uncertainty regarding any of the new programs in regards to supportive housing at all?
Sure. So, because as you know, Molly and Leo are saying, the new programs, investors look at that and don't have a track record to base it on. So they look at it. Most investors look at it as the worst case scenario. I call the what ifs. So they want to see what happens. In year 5, the contract's not renewed or it's not annually appropriated. Since we're underwriting to FMR, there's going to be some sort of overhang on the deal. So they want to kind of take a look at how that overhang is going to affect the project, and then what is the worst case moving forward on that. So it's it's good to work with your syndicator and investor to make sure you're mitigating that as soon as possible.
And you mentioned, I think, Fannie Mae and Freddie. Are they in particular looking in different areas around the state or anywhere in general?
Fannie's actually looking for supportive housing in New York. Yep.
Any rural, city, everywhere?
Yep.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yep.
That's great. So any other trends anyone is noticing in supportive housing at this moment? Paul? I don't know if there's anything.
Well, I think there's the whole trend towards moving towards serving higher and higher need residents, through the MRT program and through different programs that are really looking to deinstitutionalize folks. This actually aligns with WISFISH's mission. Our goal is really always to serve those folks who are most at need. Within the agency, you'll often hear people say, well, if we don't serve them, who will? And so, that's an attitude that we bring to the people that we lease to. On the other hand, we're currently, for instance, one of the target populations we're trying to serve are people who have come out of psychiatric hospitals, are living in congregate care settings, and now the question is, can they actually take the next step and really live in supportive housing? And so our social services team will meet, 4, 5, 6 of these before finally finding a resident who actually we feel could be successful in a supportive housing setting. So, I think we're really committed to serving these folks who are most at need, but, it takes enormous resources in order to actually, do the interviewing and do the steps you have to take in order to ensure that they'll actually be successful.
Right.
I think one of the things that we are seeing increasingly is a blurring of the line between capital letter supportive housing loan program and supportive housing as a housing model elsewhere in our new construction and sometimes even in our preservation pipelines, which is I think a real plus. Supportive housing does not have to be a standalone building that is 60% supportive housing, 40% something else. We're very often seeing Ella buildings, which is our 100% affordable program, with a 30% tier that is supportive housing. I think it helps us expand production in an era where resources are scarce and land is scarce and all the other things that we've just been saying. It also, I think, helps with making sure that we are fully integrating high needs populations into communities.
I was going to say, we're seeing a lot more deals with JVs. So people are partnering with either for-profits or with other nonprofits or development consultants to help them through construction. And I know Rebecca and Melissa and the Shinny folks put together a great guide that's on their website with, talking about JV partnerships. But we're seeing a lot more of partnerships, I think, being formed in the supportive housing.
We're seeing that too at Chase. A lot more folks looking for partners, especially with land being what it costs,
Right.
and some of these other issues and challenges to overcome. I think one of the other challenges that folks are trying to work through too is when we start mixing the state and city financing resources. And I'm opening it up to Molly and Leora just to talk a little bit about when should someone look to bring in another type of agency funder for their projects, and how do you all communicate and talk about the projects that you're thinking about financing together?
Sure. I just want to mention one thing about JVs before we do that. I think it's important for the audience in this room, which is likely an audience of providers / developers or some iteration thereof. And I think it's important if you are a provider who is not JVing or is JVing, that you really think about what your relationship is with the developer, and especially when you're working with a variety of rental subsidies, ESHI, and I'm not as familiar with the intricacies of 1515 and how it's awarded. Nevertheless, the rent needs to flow into the project, and I really think you should make sure that your role in the project is clearly defined, and it's very clear how the rent is coming into the deal, because on an ESHI side, if you are a provider, not the developer, and not in the JV, you are bringing rent to the deal, and we want to make sure the deal operates. So I just try to remember that when you're working on these relationships, that all the roles and responsibilities are clearly outlined and you know what you're bringing to the table. I just wanted to use that opportunity. Sorry, that was one of my talking points. I couldn't close the book on this without that one. I would say, I'll just open a little bit and then I'll turn it over to Molly, but I work, for those in the room who don't know me, I spend a lot of my career at HPD, so that has been, I think, helpful in that I have good working relationships with my colleagues downtown, and as well as my colleagues in Albany at HHAP and at DHCR. So I think we're all working together. I know that Supportive Housing Loan Program is always working with the folks at HHAP and myself, and I think deals cross our paths where we're thinking about what's the best combination of resources. Does the deal work best together? Does the deal work best just with the city or just with the state? And I think there are lots of ways to make these deals work. And as Molly said, we both have very full pipelines, so it's not like we're lacking for support, even supportive housing transactions. We have a lot of deals, I think, that are working those 3 or 4 ways. City, state, state alone, city alone, city with HHAP, the state with, there's a myriad way for these to do. I think that we also, just serving the rest of the state, we always want to advance the locality's goals, right? I think other cities throughout the state are also having a homelessness crisis, and I think keeping that in mind is very important. So oftentimes projects outside of New York City will come in with local sources, local home or local CDBG money. We see that happen when projects are very expensive and they want to bring other sources into the deal, or they're looking to get local, they're sort of selling their project around their locality, and this is one of the ways they can do it. But I would say we work closely together here in New York City and throughout the state with our local partners where we need to be.
Yeah, I would really echo everything Leora said. I think finding ways to work together is not our problem. We talk constantly, very involved in one another's pipelines and working through issues. And for those of you who have done projects jointly with us, that you will find that we are talking back and forth on a regular basis, not always without hiccups, but certainly we get the deals done. In terms of, which direction do you go for the sort of the risk of being over reductionist, right? You have your capital subsidy, your operating subsidy, and your rent subsidy, and you can get any combination of those from the city and the state, and sometimes you can have both of those involved in one. Sometimes both agencies are doing the capital. I think it's a question of relationships, right? So some people have a long history of working with the state, others have a longer history of working with HPD. I think it is a question of what population you're trying to serve. The 1515 populations are very broad. The ESHI populations are much more specific. I think it fits in with what other funding streams you're bringing in, whether or not you have a prevailing wage component in your deal or not, whether or not you've gone to the state's 9% round or the city's 9% round. I mean, there's sort of a slew of things. There is not a magic formula. We have taken the time to start to outline all of the different permutations of city and state, and it's got it turned into a very long spreadsheet. We will continue to make sure that we are setting things up so that we are working well together, but the bottom line is whatever the permutation is, we can find a way to get it done.
Great. So, there are always deals that come through the door that have their unique challenges to them. That pretty much all of them today, especially. So how do you manage the requests that you're getting for resources, and what are some key things that you're looking for to ensure that the project itself is not going to be over-subsidized, and maybe they've taken the right steps to ensure that they've done everything, the value engineering and things of that nature that come along with trying to limit the amount of resources that get into one particular deal?
Sure. I'd say the pre-development process with HPD is a fairly iterative one. You've heard the phrase early and often here several times on this panel, and I would echo that, right? Come to us before you acquire the site, if at all possible, right? Let's talk about it. For the most part, whether or not a project is in our pipeline or not, it is more a question of when as opposed to if. There are a handful of exceptions, occasionally having to do with developer capacity and track record with the agency. That's unusual, but certainly if somebody came in with a land acquisition price that was just way out of whack, or one of the things that there has been a lot of debate, robust debate and discussion about, including in the supportive housing pipeline, but across new construction, is where you have very low density but otherwise fully functional residential buildings, whether or not it is appropriate to tear those down and build higher density buildings if it's allowed as of right. We try not to be the entity that is starting that particular trend. If the market has already been moving and there is buildings have come down, it would be silly for us to say we won't allow it to happen. But if you have otherwise a really functional neighborhood of 2-family, 3-family homes, I would pause before we encourage you to tear anything down. That can be a challenge for us. But for the most part, we're talking about a when, not an if. And what will get you up faster in the pipeline is a tight budget, at or below term sheet, strong relationships with the community, with the elected officials. We are really interested in thinking about interesting combinations of either income bands or housing and non-housing uses. That can include the shelter housing model that Paul talked about, or some other community facility uses. When we can get a project in a neighborhood that we haven't had a lot of opportunity to work in before, that's something that can get you sort of a little faster up the pipeline. But really, there's no, I said this before, there's no magic formula that if you do this, you'll be guaranteed a spot in the next closing season. It's making sure that you have a tight project, and we will try and combine the resources so that we can get it moving as quickly as possible.
I would add that I think the roles of the government agencies are the same, right? And I think we follow similar rules of thumb. I do think that coming in early is really important to discuss the project. If it's supportive housing, you can speak with me, but also I have great colleagues who serve Western New York, Lenny Skrill and Darren Scott, who serves the Eastern region, and they can really work with you to figure out, should this be a 9% or a 4% deal, depending on the site, the location, community needs, and just their general planning experience. But in terms of getting into the closing queue, I think the 9% World offers a great opportunity. They have a $5 million in credit set aside for supportive housing. If you have a deal, you could apply for credits in the fall on the early round, and I think the requirement is to close with 180 days. So that's one way to do it. If the project is big enough and it happens to be a bond deal, we are working on a quarterly reso schedule. But in the end, we're also looking for efficient, thoughtful deals that complement community needs, not just New York City, around the state. What does the community need? What does the community want? And is it efficient, and is it thoughtful? And is it in the lens of the term sheet? Even though every deal is unique, we do set some parameters so we can work through it.
Right, so you'd mentioned coming in early and talking often and continuing to stay in touch. So this is fantastic about the early round on the 9%, and I think there'll be a 9% round here coming from the city as well. A lot of the bigger supportive housing deals downstate tend to be bond deals. So how do you manage expectations from the developers when they walk in with a very large 200 or 300 unit deal from a cap perspective, and ensuring they can get some attention?
Sure. I mean, I think if you were at Nice Alpha, I was on a panel called the Bonds or No Bonds. Are you a groupie? Are you following me? Anyway, the bottom line is we have taken the real effort to conserve cap, right? I mean, we're following in the steps of our colleagues downtown, and we're not allocating cap towards ACK rehab. So we're conserving cap for the highest cost projects throughout the state, which are generally new construction projects, as well as public housing repositionings and things like that. So that's one thing to think about, is when we've thought collectively of our cap, we're allocating it in a strategic way. I think I'm pretty communicative and transparent, so I try to give people just general parameters. We know what we're working with. We look at the boundary. We're right now gearing up for the fall and for December, and so we try to give people broad sort of time spans and when it would make sense. But it's imprecise, right? I mean, you really, you have a pipeline, and some deals close and some don't, and you kind of have swing projects, and you make it work. We are at capacity through December and are really thinking right now in 2019 and what will we be doing. We have high goals for supportive housing, and yes, larger projects that are supportive are in our pipeline. I would, with a full assurance that our June reso, every deal has a supportive housing element. So whether it's 50%, 60%, or 30%, where every deal has some supportive component to it, we look forward to doing more units on the supportive side. So don't be surprised, and if I ask you to, or Sean asks for you to increase your units from 30 to 50, because we would like to do more for the most vulnerable.
adding on to what Leora said, we've also been looking at ways that we can conserve cap in addition to the same policy about preservation projects. We've taken cap out of some of the projects that had a smaller low-income tier, replaced that with subsidy. We've strongly encouraged some of the projects that were on the borderline size-wise to go for the 9% round. Continue to look for ways that we can spread those funds around and make sure that we are making maximal use of what is a very scarce resource. For speaking for my colleagues at HDC, and there is a very robust bond pipeline, which is a good problem to have, but it does mean that if you're working on a project where you're counting on 4% credits, it may be a couple of closing cycles. But it's something that we prioritize supportive housing. It's something that really matters to us, and we should talk to understand the various implications and make sure that we are always looking to balance our pipeline to make sure that we have a mix of housing types, including supportive.
Great. So Paul, based on everything we've been talking about, the development of any project means matching sources to uses, and where does one start? For the novices in the room, how do they get started?
Well, I think we think of it, at least I think of it, in reverse chronological order. What you need first for us, because we're doing senior housing, is the seniors are not going to be able to afford their apartments if there isn't some sort of operating rental subsidy. Mm-hmm. And historically, that has always been the hardest source to find. So as we're contemplating a project, we've identified a site, we're beginning to really think about it. I think that which we feel really gives the project a green light and now it can proceed is when we have a clear idea through to how the operating subsidy is going to come in. Then I think next to that, we're thinking an awful lot about our social services sources. WISFISH, about a third of our staff are social services. We provide very robust social services to all of our residents. And we're always, we don't want to open housing that we don't feel doesn't have appropriate services to really serve our populations, which are often quite needy populations. So we're really looking to make sure that we've got that. And maybe it's overly simplistic, but I feel like once we solve those problems, the capital will follow. So not that the capital is easy, but in a way, the other parts are, I think, more difficult.
Right. So Kevin, is that the norm from some of the clients that you work with, or is that they do it in the opposite direction? There's plenty of capital, I'll figure out the services as we go, or is it?
No, that's usually the norm. And then, certain clients will come to us early on and just kind of help with the budget. What have you been seeing from the state or the city? How do you put together a budget? Sources, uses, fit within the term sheet, construction cost, and budgeting, and just ask for our advice.
Great. So project is completed, it's done, it's time to convert. How does the closing and conversion process typically work with multiple funders? I kind of throw that out to everybody. And what has some of your experiences been in doing that?
I guess just more legal documents. The legal bills are probably higher. But yeah, because we're used to dealing with multiple sources, so if you're adding one or two more layers onto it, it's just reviewing more documents. Pretty straightforward.
I mean, what's interesting is I think that the housing agencies really often can really roll with the punches at closing. And I feel like it's less that the trauma is coming there. I feel like it's often more from, it might be the investor, it might be the O agencies and it's often not even a dollars and cents thing. It's that DOB is doing something really bizarre, and even though our attorneys and sort of even say the housing agencies attorneys are sort of comfortable with this, there's a lot you have to do to make sure that all dozen sources that are going to this project are all comfortable with these curveballs that are being thrown at you by DOB, DEP. Actually, was very happy to hear that Molly refers to all this as a whack-a-mole game too, which is I thought something only I thought. But it's really is that sort of thing, and now you've just got really more parties that need to be comfortable with all these different curveballs that can come at you during the closing process.
Great. So one of the things that one of the trends today that we're starting to see more of is the issue of family supportive housing. It's a really hot topic today, and I'm curious to hear from folks just about how the financing of family supportive housing is changing some of the processes we've discussed.
I'll throw it to you first.
All right.
To add.
So just by way of overview to start, the majority of 1515 is for single adults. There is a component there for families with children, and then a young adult component, but we are still building primarily for the single adults within the supportive housing stream and the 1515 program. I mean, I think the biggest difference from a financing perspective when you're dealing with family units is that they're more expensive, right? They're bigger. It's not necessarily more expensive on a square footage basis, but we work in units and subsidies are by units. So as the units get bigger, life gets a little bit more complicated. Not to say that it can't be done. We've got some in our pipeline that will, knock on wood, be closing this month. So we work through it, we solve the problem, but it does push the boundaries of the model a little bit.
I would say, from the HCR perspective, we're open to working, obviously, with all the vulnerable populations that are listed in the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, which include families and young adults aging out of foster care, singles, SMI. So I think it's a very broad definition, as well as the population on the 1515 side. So I don't think recently have closed many family deals, but the deal that I think Molly's talking about is family that's forthcoming on both sides. And so I think we'll just take it, deal by deal to see how those construction pressures impact the budget. But I imagine it's really, while the construction is one side of it, I always say if we think it's hard to close the deal, then you have to build it and then operate it. And I imagine it has different concerns on the provider side. I mean, we will work through this and figure out how to finance it because it helps families, but I imagine the service provisions vary greatly when you're serving a variety of age groups with a variety of needs, which I can't comment on because I'm not a provider, but I imagine the folks doing that have a lot to think about.
So Paul, you work with a lot of different community boards when you're thinking about a project. What are you hearing today from a request perspective when you go out and you talk about wanting to develop a project in a particular area of New York?
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting, and this goes with other comments that Molly and Laura were making, I think that communities are very justifiably saying, what's in it for me? And I think not selfishly. I mean, the idea is, if there's going to be a major public investment creating, in the case of the 3 projects I showed, quite large projects in their neighborhood, they want to know how can they benefit from this as well. And, and I think what has actually been a very successful strategy for WSFISH, and actually aligns with sort of one of WSFISH's goals, is we're pursuing what I call a kind of cohabitation strategy or co-location strategy. So of the 3 projects that I'm showing, 2 of the 3 are going to have located in them federally qualified health centers, where they'll not only be providing medical services for our own residents, but they will provide medical care for any community member who comes in there, regardless of their ability to pay or regardless of whether or not they have insurance. And when I'm standing in front of the community board, when I'm talking to local churches or whatever and trying to sell a project, the fact that there is such a clear, tangible sort of benefit for them, that they can see within this community, makes a big difference. The other thing that we're doing is in 2 of the 3 projects again, we are including senior centers. And one of our ideas is that, these senior centers are not just for the residents of our buildings, they are for the local community. We want to have robust programming. We want to have access to sort of, health and mental services. And they won't be just for our residents, they'll be for anybody in the community. And one of the things that, for instance, in the 2 projects that are developing in the Bronx, they're an area that has a very, very high density of senior community members. And so one of the things that we can demonstrate is that there is a real need in this broader community, and that this project that we're developing isn't just for the people that are going to live there, it's actually going to serve the greater community.
I'll jump on that point from hearing from other developers and also experience from dealing with investors. I think showing the units or showing the projects is a great tool. So if it is your first project you might be building, you know, you can reach out to other folks in Shinny. I'm sure they're happy to show you some of the great work that's been done. But seeing is a big thing, I think, for people to.
And I would say, I'll just put the plug in for rest of state. I think we do see, surprisingly for me, since my experience has been downstate before coming over to HCR, seeing adaptive reuse and seeing blighted schools just standing there for years and then revitalized into affordable and supportive housing at the same time. And I think it is attractive to communities that have warehouses. We see it in Utica, in Buffalo, where converting schools and warehouses into productive uses is a big deal. And oftentimes they come back onto the tax rolls as well. So I think I think framing it in terms of urban economic development as well as development, bringing onto the tax base can help.
You know, it's funny. I mean, one other example that's so simple, but really really was a very effective tool is in the third project that I showed. There's going to be a very large dining room in that project, and there'll also be a very large sort of classroom community room. And one of the things that I would say to the local community, we heard from the community, we would like places to have meetings, to have parties, to have events. And so instead of just saying, oh, well, of course you could use our building, we actually designed the building in such a way that these large rooms have access directly from the sidewalk. And so if, in fact, the local community wants to use it, they can arrange with us in advance, and they don't have to go in our front door and walk down the hallway and feel like they're trespassing into a different building. It actually can be set up that they could enter right from the sidewalk, use that room for whatever event, and then leave again. So not in any way, shape, or form an expensive thing to add to a project, but boy, does it give you credibility when you stand in front of the group and say, this building is for you too.
Fantastic. So sort of left the best kind of towards the last. So one of the biggest challenges that everyone's working on today are construction costs, how to deal with the high construction costs and high land costs. So I'm curious to hear if anyone has any advice for folks on how to manage those costs. Paul, from a development perspective, and from an agency perspective as well, and Kevin from the tax credit perspective as well. Sure.
So I have a very strong opinion about this. You can tell me I'm wrong. So there is this, I think I'll call it a myth, that you'll get the best price by designing your own building and then going out and having a competitive bid, and you're going to really force the contractors to bid against one another, and you'll get a great price. And that's totally wrong in my opinion. And so the strategy that I've used actually throughout my entire career is to work closely with an architect to get drawings, so that the project is developed enough that contractors can begin to give you pricing. And then you hold a competitive bid at that point. So, not to use a technical term, but you might use it towards the end of the design development phase. And so you do a competitive process, you get bids from different contractors, and then at that point, you sort of say to the contractor, look, I know things are going to change. I'm not going to hold you to the penny of what you bid, but you're now our partner in moving forward with this project. And your final price had better be pretty darn close to what you've given to us. But we want to benefit from your expertise in terms of cost containment and buildability. And and what they say is amazing. Like the architects will be designing something and the contractor will say, if you make those windows 6 inches narrower and 3 inches shorter, I can get them for you for half the price. And who cares? So the windows are slightly smaller, and all of a sudden you've got this enormous cost savings. Or in the second project I showed, the contractor said, move this one bearing wall over about a foot. You're not really losing that much space, and I can't tell you how much money you're going to save. And so I think really having the contractor on board, they're doing not just giving you, say, pricing at different points of the design process, but really having them be active members of your design team is really the way that you're going to end up with the most efficient project.
I was just going to say something about land real quick. I mean, I do think I'm a big fan of a seller's note, so I'm just going to put that out there. I think if you're somehow selling to yourself, we don't want to see deals where you're taking cash out, and figure out a way to sort of work through that, acknowledging that it's a unique situation to bring land to the table and create basis and create equity, and we're all in for that. But it becomes challenging when it's a related party transaction where the government is being put in a position to basically, people are requesting to take cash out of the deal, and I think it's a fine line and it's complicated and we discuss it, but I think just keep that in mind. I don't have any solutions for the open market situation, but maybe other people do. But and the other thing I would say, what I've been observing, at least in New York City, is obviously sites are at a premium, and so people get more difficult sites to develop, which have a million issues with the MTA and all sorts of challenges. And those site conditions have been certainly driving up costs. Like I said, I don't have a solution, but that is definitely an observation. The sites are at a premium, and so they end up being really challenging to develop with egress and access and MTA issues. So I don't know what to say about Molly. Do you have anything?
I mean, I think we've seen a lot of creative solutions for site location, both inside of government and in the private sector. We are increasingly seeing partnerships with faith-based organizations. In that very often these days does not mean that the church or synagogue or whatever is fully out of just selling the site, but in fact that they are in some longer term kind of a way, either as a tenant on the ground floor or sometimes even in the development structure. It's not a completely straightforward thing to do, and I would be very careful about how you're managing the site appraisal and making sure that the benefits that are accruing to that faith-based institution in some way total up to that appraised value, or else there's going to be AG approval issues, but it certainly can be done. On the government side, I think we're getting very creative about sort of whose sites we're pillaging. We've worked a lot with NYPD, with DOT. We've been having some really interesting conversations recently with DHS about where there might be some housing sites within their land portfolio. So I think thinking beyond just what is the HPD controlled land has been a productive set of conversations. I think on the sort of larger issue of total deal cost and construction costs, we look at this on a regular basis. Hard costs in HPD projects, this is not supportive specific, but just in general, hard costs on HPD projects are moving more or less in lockstep with construction costs in New York City as a whole, right? We are part of a larger construction market. It is a very robust construction market, and we are playing in that. It is a challenging place to be. So there are things we can do to manage it, and I think that was an interesting set of suggestions, but at the end of the day, we are players in a larger market. One of the things that I urge everybody to look at is all of the other things that are getting loaded onto affordable housing projects. And sometimes we are the culprit, but sometimes it's communities and elected officials. But, we're seeing, conversations about project amenities and what rents ought to be on commercial space or community facility space, on wage rates for either workers or buildings, construction workers or building service workers, the depth of affordability, for example, on the non-supportive side. We can, in any given project, we can probably solve for 2 or 3 of these things. When we try to solve for all of them, we run into some serious challenges. So making sure that as you're getting those pressures that we're talking about them, again, sort of back to this early and often theme, because it's the ones that we're trying to solve the night before the Article 11 vote that are the ones that are really, really thorny.
Are there anything in particular that you're seeing from the local electeds? We're in June, we're closing some deals now, and we've had a few issues come up, changing the tenancy, I'm just kind of curious about, is there anything that you're seeing today that folks, as a sort of a common theme?
It has been a very interesting couple of months in the context of talking about homeless set-asides, and this applies both to supportive and more broadly the homeless set-asides that we're doing in our programs. If I had been been on this panel 2 months ago, it would have been entirely about the kind of micromanaging down of those homeless set-asides, right? why can't the 60% in a supportive housing project be 50, and why can't the 10% in an Ella building be 8%? We've pivoted rather abruptly in the last 6 weeks or so, and in fact, we're getting pushed to mandate 15% homeless set-asides across all of our new construction programs, non-supportive supportive housing programs, so things like Ella and Mix and Match. In the general scheme of things, I'm in the macro level, I'm encouraged. I think that's a promising step. I have some concern, again, when it is the night before the Article 11 vote, that is a very challenging thing to manage. So we're really trying to make sure that we're having those conversations, not just with the development teams, but with elected officials early and often. And then I think it sort of goes back to how many things are we trying to solve for in a given project? We can do some, we just can't do all.
So Kevin, how does this all translate into when you're then having to call the investor
Sure,
and say, we're now introducing
XYZ.
XYZ, yes.
Sure, I was going to say, for developers, it's tough because, right, the credit pricing's dropping, land prices are going up, and then depending on what's coming out of Washington with the tariffs, construction prices are probably going to rise again. So they're getting, yeah, right. So they're getting stressed all over the place. So what a lot of folks are doing is trying to put commercial and community space and underwriting the dollars into the budget, so then they're sizing debt on it. And so some investors have pushback with that. They're saying, look, we only want to invest in housing. We're not here to underwrite a deal with commercial. And so there's like creative ways to do it from a tax perspective. You can do an upfront lease and certain ways to work around it. But again, just to have the conversation early of how much commercial space should be in the building, how much community space, and how are we going to size the debt based on that revenue is an interesting topic.
It's certainly interesting as someone who works at a bank knows. You undoubtedly get a phone call saying, hey, geez, this traditional affordable deal looks more like a real estate deal
Correct.
that is now counting on parking revenue, commercial
space,
income, and they've added more, I don't want to say market rate units, but more mixed income units
Right.
that
Non-restricted.
in certain areas of the city are effectively market, some of the units. It's a challenge for the investors to get comfortable, or it's just a different type of transaction. And we've done a couple of mixed income deals and gotten very comfortable. But we've also had the time to sort of analyze the deals, not have to move within a couple of weeks and stay committed. So it can be a challenge for sure. So Paul, I did want to go back just on the community support perspective. One of the other challenges that does come up from time to time is, a group will go out, talk to the community board, make a proposal, beautiful schematic design, and then ultimately they realize that schematic design is going to cost $500 a foot. I'm just making up a number now. How do you manage those expectations with the community board? We hope not either. I'm just, let's say 400, but how do you sort of manage that delicate balance of delivering what the community is looking for, but also delivering a high quality building that's got everything that everyone is asking for?
So your question is that typically the community might be pushing you to do a more expensive building? Okay. I guess that has been less my experience. I think that what the community typically is looking for is a building that they feel is appropriate for the neighborhood. So they're more focused on issues of height, transparency on the street, sort of those issues, not so much whether or not it looks gilded or, in some respects, a terrifically expensive building. So I feel like that's been less the issue. The issue more has to do with, I think, balancing the pressure that we feel and that we agree with, that we get from the public agencies, of wanting to maximize the number of supportive and affordable units that we can put into a building, whereas the community might want you just to do a cute little affordable housing building, and why does it need to be so big? So I think trying to balance those two is more the issue that we have to face.
Okay, thanks. The sort of last thing to talk about, with the real estate market has just, has exploded across, the entire state. And as a result, it's getting harder and harder to find sites that are, and make a proposal to do affordable housing development in certain areas. So I'm curious how everyone is hearing or actually dealing with the issues of NIMBYism. especially as it relates to supportive housing and citing a supportive housing deal, around the state. So I'm just kind of curious what folks' thoughts are about that and any advice you might have.
I mean, I do think Shinny does a great job in sort of helping their constituencies and how to frame this supportive housing to the larger community. And I think the providers in the room should access their services for that. Ooh, okay. Party next door. I would say I have been surprised on how much I see it around the state. I'm going to not talk about New York City because I've been working on deals throughout the state. It's definitely there. It's definitely there on the affordable side, and it's certainly there. People don't want supportive housing, affordable housing in areas around the state, and many folks have preconceived notions of what supportive housing means. I have seen projects have to take on different populations to try to accommodate the NIMBYism, and they perhaps would alter who they're serving. It has happened. The project in Kingston was voted down by the planning board, but eventually succeeded to get the approvals. But it is, senior supportive housing in Kingston and adaptive reuse, no less. It's a super interesting, cool project. But I think it's throughout the state. I don't have a solution, and Shinny's not on the panel, but or maybe Paul could address how you react to NIMBYism around the state. But clearly education and taking people to sites and explaining how valuable this tool is. And I would just like to use this as an anecdote. Recently I've been reading in the real estate section about, we work and we live, and how they're starting we live, and it's community living. And, I think but sort of framing what is supportive housing, and don't we all really want a place that creates a community in our building and that offers us an opportunity, not just for case management, for creating community. There are probably ways to sort of frame it in a different way to share that experience with those communities that somehow have a preconceived notion about what it is.
I mean, we've just been through a very intensive community engagement process on the last project I showed on West 108th Street. And I think, one thing that I sort of finally came to as a realization was I think a constituency that historically would have supported affordable and supportive housing, let's say, are middle-class renters. And I think that partially one of the things that's going on now is not so much to say that that group doesn't like poor people or they're scared of supportive housing. It's that they themselves are feeling enormous pressure for their own rents. And they're worried about, whether or not they're going to be able to continue to themselves afford living in New York City. And in the project we did in particular, whether or not they could continue to afford to have a car in New York City. That became a whole dynamic on its own. And it's funny, I think that partly their own fear gets translated into NIMBYism. As they're fearful about their own ability to afford, their lives here, they are less generous in supporting subsidy and public input in making other people able to afford living in New York City.
Paul is a much kinder and more thoughtful person than I am, apparently. I certainly see NIMBY alive and well, both with supportive housing and really, frankly, unfortunately, all of our affordable housing, particularly those with homeless set-asides. I want to echo what Leora said, that Shinny does a tremendous job in leadership and education to try and help people understand what supportive housing really is. And I think all of your buildings are the best advertisement that we possibly can have, because they are beautiful buildings. We require every project to go to the local community board, even when it's an as-of-right project, just to make sure that the dialogue exists, and that we are identifying any issues that may come up, and that we are giving people an opportunity to be heard. I think it has resulted in generally better community relations than we would have otherwise, occasionally changes to projects, but really mostly things on the margins and that have to do more with some of the community facility space, as Paul was mentioning. But it's something that we continue to struggle with. We continue to hear people equating shelter and supportive housing. We continue to hear pushback. So I think I don't have an easy answer for this one, unfortunately.
I would just add on, we've, closed a few deals upstate in the past couple of years, and it took 2 or 3 years to get through planning board. The one big thing the developer said is, make sure the person who's gonna be in town is the one presenting. So the person they're gonna see at the, coffee shop or the diner, all the time is the one coming to the boards and presenting. So it's not some outside person coming in and trying to look, hey, this is what we're doing for your town. It's, you're in the community, you're the ones that's gonna build it and stand by it. You should be the one that's in front of the planning board.
That's great. Well, it's certainly great advice. So we've got roughly 10 minutes left. We thought we'd leave some time for some questions from the audience. So Tim O'Hanlon's right in the front row.
That's not fair.
I just want to mention first that Paul hasn't mentioned once on his 108th Street project that he destroyed or will destroy about 150 parking spots.
500.
500. I wouldn't dare say that number. So the neighborhood it must have been a riot, a near riot. You would have had 500 families protesting this project. And you would have said, well, people before cars. Well, that wouldn't have gotten real far on the west side of that. That must have been a real difficult one.
Tom, what's the? There's so many places I could go with that. What's your question? Sort of.
You don't have to say anything.
Well, I mean.
Commenting, you left that little.
It's pop-up video.
Okay, so I will say what's interesting is exactly what Tim said at the end is what won the day. Now, remember, this is the west side of Manhattan. You have a lot of people who self-identify as being very liberal, and this was really the test of their souls, sort of honestly. I mean, I'm not kidding. And so it was when we were able to essentially have the dialogue be what's more important, parking or affordable housing, that we won the day. And I remember there was a poster that said, it's more important that a person has a place to sleep each night than that a car does. And when the dialogue shifted to that, that was when the neighborhood, I think, really got behind the project. So it was, in a way, going for the jugular, really not hiding what this issue was about. And saying, this is a very important project and this reflects Upper West Side values and we would like you to get behind this.
Are there any other questions? Oh, right here in the back.
Thank you for the comments. I just wonder whether there's a tension between the cost containment and the mayor and governor's goals to build supportive housing at such a rapid clip. And obviously I think there is. And how do you balance those facts? Obviously not an easy decision, but how do you think about the need, the homelessness crisis and also the real estate market that we're all facing?
I mean, it's certainly infinitely easier to make my numbers if I was not worried about money at all, right? I mean, so yes, the tension exists. But on the flip side of that, I also have a very robust pipeline. It's true across the board, which means that when I am determining which projects are coming into the pipeline every year, I can, on the margins, say this one is a little bit more efficient, right? If I do these 9 projects, I can afford to squeeze in a 10th one, whereas if I do these 9, I can't, and so I'm gonna get to more units this way. It is not as nearly as black and white as I just made it sound, but so while yes, the tension exists, I think also just being in a state of being very ramped up and very production oriented gives us a moment to do a little bit of picking and choosing.
I agree.
I was just going to say that, one of the challenges on the second project I showed was, we said to the architects, we want you to design a really beautiful building, but this is going to be a prevailing wage building. It's going to cost a fortune because it's prevailing wage. And so we're giving you the challenge. You have to design a beautiful building that's going to be cost efficient. And that was just from the word go, we kept reinforcing that as sort of the goal that they should be working towards. Who was the architect? Perkins Eastman.
Any other questions? I don't see any hands up. So, well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, and thank all the panelists as well.